We are live
Oh
from
boy.
London, from Tashkent, and from, I'm just going to say Cyprus because I don't know which town James resides in. But yes, we are live for another episode of Two Liberals and a Marxist. I will be printing t-shirts at some point. Hello, everyone. My name is Piotr. I'll let the other two gentlemen introduce themselves. But this is our regular Sunday live stream where the three of us, of varying views, I believe. I mean, I don't know if James is a self-proclaimed liberal. I'm not. I'm not sure if Michael is a self-proclaimed Marxist, but we get together to talk about some of the recent big and dramatic developments of the past week, say couple of weeks in this case. We probably will be sticking to every 2 weeks, I think, at this point, gentlemen, just to make sure we've got a bit more to talk about. I think the primary thing we do want to talk about is also Turkey, but there's obviously issues from Israel and Gaza to, well, there's some things I'm watching in Africa, but of course, Ukraine and Russia and the bombings of the car in Moscow yesterday. But I mean, this is part of the fun of the streams. We sort of take these conversations where they organically flow. So, I mean, gentlemen, I pass to you guys who would like to kick off or introduce or take it as you wish.
I'll defer to James. I had the opening salvo last time around.
Okay. Oh, all right. Well, good evening all, and apologies for delays or actually starting a little bit early, depending on whose stream you're watching. I think the big news is, of course, what we've been seeing in Turkey. Maybe not quite as resonant as it was last week, but there are still huge demonstrations going on, and this is something that I have been, I've spent, well, I was about to say years, but in fact it's actually decades now studying Turkey. Fascinating country in all sorts of ways, and I often say to people when they say they work on Turkey or they watch Turkish politics, do they remember the pre-Erdogan era? Because, of course, that's going back now a quarter of a century. It really is phenomenal. And I can remember very, very clearly the night that AKP won that historic victory in November 2002, and the sense that something very dramatic had happened. And I think it's very difficult for people now who haven't really can't remember the period before to remember just how utterly chaotic Turkey was in the 1990s. That you had a military coup in 1980, and then you had most of the 1980s was spent under effective military rule. It sort of officially ended in 1983, but the military kept a very close eye on things, and then you had this chaos that sort of emerged. And I always say, if people can remember the names, True Path Party and, the Motherland Party, ANAP and DYP, that's a real sign that they've been following Turkey for a very long time. And then you had Erdogan came in, and I remember just this sort of sense that Erdogan was this character who was going to really shake things up, but the sense was very much in a positive way. That there were always real suspicions about, was he actually more Islamist than he sort of presented himself as being? But certainly in the first few years, we saw all the right comments come from Erdogan. We saw all the right moves come from him. He set EU accession as the country's number one priority, and he realized in order to do that, he needed to improve relations with neighboring Greece, and more importantly, to solve the Cyprus issue. I have to say, Cyprus is right down the agenda now. I mean, I say to people, you could solve Cyprus tomorrow, and it wouldn't actually make a big change on Turkey's EU accession prospects now, because there are so many other things that have come to the fore. But of course, when Erdogan was elected, Cyprus was the number one issue on the agenda in EU-Turkish relations. I mean, there were other things, but Cyprus was the one that everyone spoke about. And we had this sort of period of major reform, an easing up in a lot of areas. He pushed away the military. We thought very successfully, and that was cheered on by a lot of outside observers who said, look, this is actually a good thing. And then it all started to go awry. I was going to use another expression there. I held myself back. About 10 years later, And we had these Gezi Park demonstrations. And ever since then, what we have seen is this gradual, more and more authoritarian Erdogan leading up to what we've seen just now. So I think, it's been truly fascinating. Turkey is just generally a fascinating country, but it's been a fascinating period to be observing this political change. And of course, here we are now, where everyone is asking themselves, is this it now? Is this Erdogan in power until there is no more Erdogan? Or is there something else going on here? Or will people overthrow him? And I think, I remember saying, gosh, it must almost be, it must be over a decade now, in a tweet that I can't remember what it was. It was just one of many things that had happened, saying that Erdogan was as close to politically indestructible as I'd ever seen a politician. I mean, you could argue that there's, well, I mean, you were about to say sort of people like Assad and stuff, but we've seen what's happened to him. But Erdogan has just managed to survive so much and has changed Turkey in such significant ways that it's just been astounding to watch and to where we are now. So that is my rather long opening comment on what we've seen in Turkey. And it as I say, I really don't know where this is going to go now.
Well, the European Union have come out and said that they urge Ankara to uphold, quote, democratic values. It's obviously, there was a huge gathering in Istanbul yesterday, organized by the opposition and associated with that Imamoglu, who I know I'm not going to say Turkish names correctly. I did visit Turkey last year, though, for a good almost month. And it was fascinating to see the history of the South. I mainly went to Antalya. So many Russians. I find if you talk to local Turkish people, they say there's quite a big distinction between Western Turkey or Bodrum, which is sort of more Western American, English sort of holiday. And then you've got Antalya, which is more the Russian side. But I also find Turkey fascinating as an example of, political theory in action, in the sense that I think Turkey is a quintessential example of a country that is competitively authoritative, but has been on this spectrum of, teetering between more democratic to more authoritarian. And as Erdogan has gotten older, as he's faced more opposition, it's like Hungary. He's pivoted more and more towards that centralization of power. And I was reading one article stating that they got like over 1.5 million people came to vote early on in support of Imamoglu's initial bid. I think I can't remember the exact context of the article, but like basically the Turks, who are very politically active in terms of wanting to see the end of Erdogan's tenure, are very active. But there's still a very strong stranglehold he has over the rural communities in the east, in the south, and it's sort of similar to Russia in that way. I feel like Turkey's like Russia light, because Erdogan is very appealing to the rural classes, the older generations, but the more educated, sort of internationalized communities in the cities are obviously aware of what he is. The only issue is that he hasn't centralized power as well as Putin has. He hasn't purged the entire political class of oppositions or whatever. So they still hold these sham elections, which are less shammy than Russia, but still like, and it all comes after 2016, I think. But I don't know, that's some quick reactions to your thoughts, James. Michael, you're in Russia, or well, around that area, and also actually I wanted to ask you about that, because of the unique relationship the Turkish have with the Stan states, right? Mm-hmm. And this growing Turkish sort of influence there.
Mm-hmm. Where to begin? I mean, Erdogan is a tyrant. He's authoritarian. He's corrupt to the bone. He's desperate to hold on to power. I'm no fan of the man, but yet I will also state that he is the most astute leader that Turkey has had since Mustafa Kemal. And I don't think anybody is going to disagree with that. He has become much more erratic over the last couple of years. I would say over more than a decade. I agree with James, is that he comes in initially in the early 2000s as a reformer. And ultimately, in the beginning, I had thought that this would be the long-awaited and highly justified death knell for Kemalism, which had run its course. It's a type of nationalism that was, and still is, in my opinion, just completely outdated for a country like Turkey. Even though he has and continues to support more Ottoman nostalgic narratives, the use of political Islam. And of course, he taps into and continues to successfully tap into the rural central Anatolian vote. It is the voice of Konya and Kayseri and Sivas and the Pontic region versus the cosmopolitanism of Istanbul, Izmir, Antalya, and Ankara. And yes, of course, over the last 15, 20 years, there have been major migrations from Anatolia to major urban centers like Ankara, Trebizond, and Istanbul, which has changed the electoral dynamics of the country. Whereas one could say today the last major CHP strongholds, the Kemalist strongholds, are in Izmir and Edirne, the border town with Greece. But with all of that said, Erdogan has been in power now for over 20 years. And like longtime leaders like Orban or Putin, younger generations know only him. And so they can't juxtapose what life was like prior versus where it is now. And this has been, I think, a rather successful strategy that Putin has done with Russia by playing up the memories of the chaos of the 90s and then added to that the nostalgia of what the Soviet Union was. Turkey is a different story because the economy is continuing to deteriorate. Political rights and civil liberties are increasingly violated. If I'm not mistaken, Turkey has the highest number of incarcerated journalists per capita of any country in the world. And to now suddenly issue an arrest warrant for Ekrem İmamoğlu, the current president of Istanbul and the sort of the perceived successor of whoever comes after Erdogan now, is either unbelievably bold because he can get away with it, or absolutely desperate as a one last gasp effort to not for Erdogan to hold on to power, but for the AKP, which is really what this is all about. I think most people have made their peace that Erdogan is going to be in power until like the day that he dies. And whether that means that he will continue to run for office as a way of ensuring some kind of immunity, or if he can secure a legacy for himself where AKP will continue to govern after he steps down, providing him that protection and that immunity, that will be the only thing that he will do. But knowing that there is growing discontentment within the country, and that if we understand Turkey to be ultimately a two-party system between CHP and AK, the Kemalists are, as I said, I think the Kemalism itself is outdated, and I think that there needs to be something new to all of this. I also think that Kemalism has been appropriated largely by Erdogan's Islamists, because it's not so much Islam that is being used as a political culture, but Turkish Islam in that regard, right? I mean, probably the best example of him fusing Turkish nationalism with Islamism is his decision a couple of years ago to reconvert Hagia Sophia into a mosque. And then about a month, or I don't know how many months later, the monastery of Hora as well, both that were operating as museums, which, next to cats and ATM machines, Istanbul has a multitude of mosques. I mean, they don't need any more. People are saying, like, really? Another mosque? Wow, okay. I mean, we were using this as a museum. We were getting good money with tourism. Now, all of a sudden, that's done. He does a lot of this, right? Every Hagia Sophia in the country, whether it's in Trebizond or Izmit, Nicaea, it's just about ready to be restored into a working museum. And then suddenly, boom, you know what we need to do? Let's turn that into a mosque. And I was in Trebizond last October. Nobody is happy with this. Nobody is happy with this because it's just seen as, political interference on, local economies. So, anyway, my own 2 cents with all of this, and then we can pivot towards Turkey's sort of cosplaying in Central Asia as their belief that they are part of the Turkic nation. There's a difference between Turkic and Turkish. Turkic is what you find in Central Asia. Turkish are people like Greeks and Armenians and Anatolians who converted to Islam a generation or so ago for the tax purposes and to avoid the seasonal genocide. And somehow they think that they're cosplaying as Kazakhs. Erdogan's Turkish has a distinctive Georgian accent to it, but, converts to an identity tend to be quite nationalistic. And yes, it is played up in a couple of circles here in Central Asia, but, the general attitude here in Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan is, look, Turkey wants to invest. They want to help out our economy. Great. But if Erdogan wants to provide us with an Ottoman structured mosque in the center of our city, thanks. But we already have historical mosques and we're pretty good. We don't really need any of that kind of stuff,
I think that Turkey's quite interesting in that way because it does have, well, maybe it's Erdogan's foreign policy more than the country itself, but Turkey's always had this quite unique approach to sort of the Middle East generally. It's always sort of seen itself, his neo-Ottomanism, which I think he's kind of ditched a little bit more. I mean, he was, even when I was living in East Africa, there was a strong emphasis of Turkey and the desire to sort of grow Islam in parts of Eastern Africa, which are obviously heavily Christian. They own a space facility or complex in Mogadishu, of all places, in Somalia. They've always approached, I think, the Middle East with a slightly different way, and their relations with Qatar during that period when the Gulf states were quite fragmented was quite interesting. But also, as you say, through these things like the OTS or Organization of Turkic States, I think is quite, Turkey, despite the size of its economy or where it is, it does have quite a good ability to reach quite far its sphere of influence. To whether or not it's received well is one thing, but I think there's certainly no degree of opportunism from Ankara in that way. I don't know if you'd agree with that, James or Michael, but I've always been fascinated by Turkey's sort of slightly different approach to foreign policy like that.
Yeah, I mean, it is a mixed bag. It's sort of the way in which the British like to think that the former empire benefited under the British, and then you just ask everyone and say, well, what do you think? And they're like, well, no, not really, but it's nice that you think that. So, I mean, I'm not exactly sure what the rest of the Middle East thinks of Turkey's neo-Ottomanism. I'm pretty certain that I'm sure that the Syrians have something different to say about that, but that's what I also wanted was just with what's happening in Syria and stuff, and Azerbaijan and Armenia, if we touched on a couple of weeks ago. Turkey's got a lot of things going on in its near abroad right now. Right. And a lot of that can come undone. I think we talked about this in a couple of weeks ago. We said a lot of this can come undone the minute AKP is no longer in power. And right now that is riding on the physical persona of Erdogan. If he can secure a successor to the party, mission accomplished. But right now, it really seems apparent that people are waiting for change. They're done. They're done with AKP. They're done with Erdogan. It doesn't mean that there is a wide-scale uprising throughout the country. We need to understand that Erdogan still has support, but that support is waning. And the only support that he can get right now is with far-right parties like MHP, which, again, plays into this idea of Turkish nationalism, which appropriates Islam within this form of Turkish Islam. So it is very much a nationalistic element, far worse than anything coming out of the Kemalist camp at this point.
One of my favorite analysts, who's actually he's on the political sort of list of terrorists, he says he just sees Erdogan as a snake oil salesman. He's just a guy who wants to sort of bribe you and just that. I don't know if you'd agree with that, James, but sort of
no. I mean, look, it's sort of, and I'm just also looking at the comments and people saying, "Oh, but this is really unfair. People aren't, just all anti-Erdogan." No, listen, I was very clear to anyone who was listening from the start that I've followed Turkish politics now for over 30 years. And like many others, I was very positive about Erdogan when he was first elected. He made all the right noises and everything like that. But you've got to be completely blind to exactly what's been going on in Turkey to still believe that this modernizing figure who came to power 20 years ago is still that figure today. And there are very good reasons why people have turned against him. And I can give the whole litany of things that he's done. that, you know, he has become increasingly authoritarian. He's completely rewritten the constitution to create a US-style executive presidency, which I have to say, you know, and we've discussed before, I think is an absolutely terrible model for countries. And it's becoming very clear why it's such a terrible model for countries, because it centralizes too much power in one person's hands, and it also blurs the boundary between church and state. That was a slip there, but interesting one. Between the symbolism of the state and the day-to-day executive authority. And I just don't think that's a particularly good thing. And I think Erdogan, as we're seeing with Trump, blurs that boundary in very, very disturbing ways. But, you know, we can point to all sorts of other ways that, you know, figures, you know, the economy has taken a real dive. We've seen that the interference in politics, we've seen many, I mean, the fact is there were huge earthquakes which led to tens, if not hundreds of thousands of deaths.
Yes.
And in any other country, a political leader would have had to take responsibility after having been in power for 20 years. Why so many buildings collapsed. Erdogan survived this. You know, this is somebody who isn't, you know, has steadily gone over to the dark side, and I think it is really disturbing. And so, you know, when people say, oh well, you know, but people are all just anti-Erdogan, yeah, but if I am sounding anti-Erdogan, it was a very, very good reason, because, as I say, so much of the promise that we had, and I remember very clearly. I went to Turkey about 2 weeks before the Gezi protests, and then I went about 2 weeks after, if you can sort of identify when 2 weeks after would be. And it was a really, really odd experience, because I remember going about 2 weeks beforehand thinking, this is Erdogan at the height of his power. And thinking, you know, this is somebody who, if he were to step down now, would go down as one of the great Turkish leaders. That if he'd known when to step back, if he'd said, listen, my job is done, I've set the country on a new path, you know, you, and I think that so much of that possibility to have established himself as the new Ataturk, for example, has been lost. And all right, you will have the supporters, and we can see those in the comments. And, you know, whenever you deal with Turkey, it's very, very polarized. There are still a lot of people who fervently support Erdogan. But I think we have to face up to the fact that he's done a lot of damage. And I think the press side is really interesting, because, of course, we've seen reports. I mean, we know now that over 2,000 people have been arrested in this latest range of protests. And remembering, these protests have been peaceful up till now. You know, these haven't turned to violence. So, you know, we'd seen people being arrested for essentially peaceful protesting. But what we've also seen is a number of journalists who've been deported. So, for example, Mark Lowen, the BBC journalist, who actually I know has a deep affection for Turkey. He'd spent a lot of time there. He'd been the BBC correspondent. He'd gone back to cover those. He was suddenly deported. You know, this is incredible stuff. And remembering that Turkey is still officially a candidate for EU membership. Now, we know that that's not going anywhere, but it is still on the books. And of course, it is a NATO member. You know, it's extraordinary that we're seeing these sorts of developments in a country which is a candidate for EU membership. Not the first one that we're seeing this, of course, because of course Georgia, but also a NATO member. To see this is just remarkable. And so, yeah, as I say, I come back to my original point. I think it's really quite incredible to see how Turkey has changed. I just actually, before I will give one anecdote. I actually have spoken to Erdogan. I had a conversation with him many years ago, which was an incredible experience, as you can imagine. He went to he gave a talk at St Anthony's in Oxford. And, you know, this was still very much when he was seen as the sort of modernizer. And there was a drinks reception, non-alcoholic, I have to assure you, before we went up for dinner. And I found myself talking to him for about 10, 15 minutes with two journalists, I won't say but from very prominent publications. And as you can imagine, it was the most fascinating conversation. You know, and he was laying out, you know, what he wanted to do to restrict the power of the military. He was talking about sort of, you know, the fact that kids who'd been to religious schools couldn't join the army. He was determined to change that. And it really was. But I think the thing that really stood out for me is that he was utterly inscrutable. And I remember speaking many years later to a journalist from a very big news organization, a Turkish journalist, who sort of explained that this was very much, Erdogan is very much a product of his particular circumstances, of a very, very specific Turkish context that is very difficult for outsiders to understand. And this person sort of explained it to me that, you know, and it's something they actually have in the Balkans as well, that you have a local fixer. So it's not a mafia or, you know, organized crime, but it's the person in the neighborhood that you go to get things done. And Erdogan was that person in his neighborhood in Istanbul. And that's why he ended up becoming the mayor as well. He appealed, and people understood this, that this was somebody who would get things done. And it very, very much so of a Turkish context that didn't seem to export terribly well. And I'm yet to be corrected, but I don't think Erdogan speaks another language. He might know Arabic, I suppose, but and I've often wondered if that has also had an effect on all of this. That you get the sense that he's very sheltered in a Turkish context, that he doesn't know the world outside terribly well and doesn't really want to. He's very interested in extending Turkey's influence over the outside world, but that cultural element, I think, is a really, really fascinating. And as I say, you can imagine, I mean, sort of having 10, 15 minutes to talk to him, you know, it's something that obviously, you know, I've always remembered, but also very much that sense of trying to get a sense of who this person was, and how very difficult I think it is
so
for
which year was that,
to
James?
understand him.
When did you talk to him? Which year?
So I'm just trying to think when this must have been. It must, I guess, around 2008, 2009.
Mm-hmm. So early.
Oh, so he was very
so relatively early. Exactly.
Early.
It wasn't, you know, it wasn't before everything went with Gezi protests, and he became sort of essentially, you know, EU and NATO would sort of tolerate him and things like that. But, you know, no, it was very much when he was still seen as this modernizing figure, and this was a major keynote lecture given at St Antony's College, Oxford.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
You know,
yeah,
that was very much he was seen as this figure.
Yeah, and I think that resembles to me, again, sort of in ways, the different phases that he's gone through or had as, well, shall we say, a democratically elected individual to autocrat. He's gone through this transition, and as we've said before, he has taken maybe notes from Putin in sort of the idea of building this strongman identity. But I find the Turkish-Russian relationship very interesting because, I mean, I think The Economist have called it cooperatively competitive. You know, they work when they can with each other, but ever since 2016, I think, at least in this context of these two, was a marked year. We had the coup in Turkey, but we also had the shot of the Russians joining the Middle East more extensively, and obviously that jet being shot down, and that completely deteriorated the sort of, should we say, functional relationship that the two had. I don't think there's any love lost between them in, say, the Caucasus, but they've been
well. I mean, this is something that
collaborative.
This is not just something from the past decade. This is something from the past 3 centuries.
No.
You know, that it's a very interesting relationship between Turkey, broadly speaking, obviously the Ottoman Empire, and Imperial Russia, and then Soviet Union, and that Russian-Turkish relationship is absolutely fascinating if you trace it, and it is very important to understand. But it was also something that was very much neglected for a long time in Turkey, and also from outside scholars, for example. Very, very few people looked at that relationship between Turkey and Russia.
No, and I think that the relationship in a foreign policy sense has been augmented by their personal relationship, or their lack of, in recent years. And the bottom point I was trying to get to is that, like Putin, who has gone through phases in terms of how his perception on reality has changed, his paranoia has increased, especially after the car bomb yesterday, or whatever the heck it was, right? The same, you can say, has gone with Erdogan, in that he had his first phase where he was modernizing, he was a reformer, and then as the 2010s began to evolve, he began to regress, and then the coup happened, and the whole thing has gone backwards, and he's completely unraveled all the progress that he made, arguably speaking. And then, of course, there is the relationship with, I think, the EU, as you said. I remember a couple of years ago when the Germans and French were proposing that 4-tiered European structure. So you had like the most inner circle, then you had the outer circles going outwards, and sort of this was meant to be an idea of how to restructure the EU so that there could be sort of staggered integration or staggered interaction between different countries, and that would mean that Turkey is not just left in a limbo with the EU, but equally they didn't have as much integration, which I don't think many European capitals want. But I don't know, Michael, what do you think?
I think, sorry, can I just very quickly, sorry, Michael, just come back on that. I mean, I think the EU element is so interesting in all of this, because I think there's a pattern that we've seen with a number of leaders that see EU as very beneficial at one point, and then at some point they see it as incredibly constraining. And Orban, for example, is a really good example of this. You know, but he's in, you know, Hungary's in the EU and things. But I'm always reminded as well of Gruevski in what is now North Macedonia, who came into power as this real modernizing figure, and then got a little bit too much taste for power, and then realized that actually the EU became the biggest impediment to his being able to retain control, and so started to turn against it, but knew that it would be electorally incredibly unpopular to make the entire break. So it became a fascinating way of remaining in power, not having the EU suspend anything, but making sure that it doesn't go forward, and it doesn't, you know, it becomes this really odd dance that we see.
Well, I think it's a fascinating one. For me, I think it's a perfect illustration of just how effective Turkey is, or Erdogan is, at doing so much more than you might initially think from a country like Turkey, right? The amount of funding they've had from the European Union by stemming the flow of migrants after the migration crisis. I was in Greece, I was in Cyprus during that period doing some humanitarian work, and so I saw firsthand sort of the way that the Turkish influence was, even if it might not be there in physical terms, there was just like, what is Turkey doing to influence the flow of migrants coming from Syria, particularly obviously in that 2015-16 period. So yeah, Turkey, and it's, if you've ever read, is it Tim Marshall's book, you know, Prisoners of Geography? Fantastic piece of literature from a British writer. For people who are watching, I highly recommend it. And he just breaks down very much why geography itself is such a core component of anything geopolitical. And Turkey is the prime example of this, because they are just, well, their location couldn't be better in terms of how much they can control or command, at least involvement in diplomatic and economic and strategic discussion. But anyway, sorry, Michael, I know you're itching to probably jump in.
I mean, there's a number of angles that we can do. I mean, you know, Turkey has, especially under Erdogan, been successful in playing one other card, one other very important foreign policy card, and that is Turkey is neither East nor West, but they can be both, and they like to play both sides. I think that's why is what it said. He's a fantastic snake oil salesman. He'll be Putin's friend one day, and then he'll run to the rescue of Zelensky the next. You know, the relationship between Erdogan and Putin, I think, is one of begrudging respect. They see each other not as friends, but they see each other as regional partners, regional negotiators. Or than anything else.
Colleagues or something, more like associates, like a business terminology or
something like that. Yeah, I mean, look, when you've been in business, I mean, you know, Putin's been in power for 25 years. Erdogan has been in power now for what, about 23, a little bit less than that. So you know a thing or two. You become familiar with each other. Certainly, it is not the same type of congenial level that we have between Putin and Xi Jinping. Putin certainly puts much more respect and deference to China than to Turkey. But it is something, right? It is something that the EU is still looking at in light of the impending peace agreements, ceasefire arrangements surrounding Ukraine. What will Turkey be able to do as far as leveraging Russia's increased influence in the Black Sea? what they will do in terms of being part of some diplomatic coalition defending, Ukraine's remaining sovereignty, still remains to be seen. But I think also this stems beyond Erdogan. This isn't something that is unique to him or his party, which goes again to the big issue here, and that is the arrest of Imamoglu on bogus charges of some kind of academic fraud, some type of corruption. I mean, what political actor in Turkey today has not been engaged in some form of academic fraud or any of the other things that was leveled against Imamoglu? My guess, once again, is that this is simply a way of demobilizing CHP in preventing any serious electoral comeback from a party that is, I will say, has over the years become increasingly irrelevant, increasingly outdated, increasingly wedded to an ideology that was more beneficial for the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But because Turkey is largely a two-party system, even though there's other political parties out there, but the likelihood of, HDP or MHP or any of these being elected is few and far between. It's either CHP or AK. And so the protests against Erdogan are going to largely collectivize within CHP. Again, you don't vote for the party that you like. You vote against the party you don't want by voting for its biggest and chiefest rival. So this is ultimately what many in Turkey are seeing, is that this is an attempt by Erdogan in particular to just brazenly retain power as much as possible. And James talked about the Gezi protests. We just mentioned also a big one, and this is, I think, in my opinion, the real game changer, and that was the 2016 false flag coup. The one that, according to Erdogan, there was an attempt by the military to seize power. Most of my colleagues, most of my academic friends and colleagues in Turkey and in the United States who know this were all saying this is the most bogus coup that I've ever seen in my entire life. This is really a way, just does not happen. The military, they go, look, we know what happened. When the military wants to try to assert power in Turkey, they've got a playbook. This has not been what was going on. But it was a way for Erdogan to jail his opponents and to also denude the power of the military. Because it's not just the military per se, but an older political elite that ran the country. And Erdogan's political electoral base comes from historically those areas, those districts of Turkey that were always subordinate, that were always looked down upon by this. If you want, you talked before about the geographic areas, Western Turkey, the areas that like 100 years ago was still Greek, very much Mediterranean in that regard, became the new Turkish political elite after 1923. And basically enjoyed running that country for the next 80 or so years. Erdogan's populism comes from the lower classes, and this is what makes him this incredibly charismatic character. So, you can play the populist card like we talked about with Orban in Hungary or Le Pen in France, Farage in the UK, to a lesser extent Fico in Slovakia. But, it's not a one-to-one comparison here. I mean, every country is unique, is unique in that sense. I would say that Erdogan is his party is much more vulnerable in Turkey than Russia's United Russia Party or Putin is, just simply because Russia is just ultimately a security state. I mean, you just need to understand if you think that Russia is just simply run by Putin, you're an amateur. I mean, just hand back your diploma if you got one. You overpaid for it.
No, just on that point, I think that, Erdogan has wanted to turn Turkey into more of what Russia was, right? Russia in the early 2000s is sort of where Erdogan was trying to take, and he's trying to take Turkey more and more, because in the earlier 2000s under Putin, you did have one at least initial election, which was like, oh, okay, there's actually an election going. And then after that, he centralized the power. But I think with Erdogan, he's just been so at it. And I know people are going to be having a go at me for my pronunciation, but I'm an Englishman, so sorry about that. But I did want to say there were quite some interesting comments here. There's a lot of people who are very actually pro, as you were saying, James. There's a lot of pro Erdogan, and I mean, I'm going to be honest that I deplore the guy. I think he's destroying the country's opportunity to be more of a democratic state, but that's very much my opinion. It's not necessarily just analysis. But I'm curious, I guess, Michael, just like, Turkey's had this quite unique position in the Ukraine war, and obviously it was being quite central to the grain deal and through in and out of the Bosphorus Strait. And as we talk right now, the Americans are meeting with both the Russians and the Ukrainians in the same building but on different levels.
Yes,
which is sort of reminds me of the Americans and the Iranians talking in two different rooms and the Iranians going back and forth last year. Fun comparison there. But what do you think, could Turkey play a role in helping to secure this new grain deal, if we want to call it that, and enabling Russian ships to go back and in and out of the Black Sea?
That's well, I mean, that is their geographic ace in the hole is their control over the Bosphorus. That is the gateway to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. So just by that alone, Turkey is an incredibly important partner for this. I know that Erdogan has said that he is willing to be a negotiator, just like it was in the Istanbul agreements of 2022. This is frequently noted by both Putin and Lavrov. So it keeps Turkey obviously important. Turkey is it is a regional power that cannot and should not be ignored, regardless of who is running it and regardless of the dynamics inside that country. But Turkey is a strategic country as far as Russia, Ukraine, and the U.S. are concerned, right? And as far as the grain deal, if I'm not mistaken, last I had checked, Trump is very much in favor of restarting this because much of Ukraine's grain is already owned and operated by outside external powers, which is the reason why the EU and the U.S. were so upset when this had been halted, when this had been scuttled a couple of years ago. Also why smaller countries in the EU like Hungary and Slovakia, and to a lesser extent, but Poland as well, were not in favor of just blank check importation of Ukrainian grain because it cuts into their own local markets. The reason why the powers that be are so adamant about this Ukrainian grain is because, as I just said, they are the ones that own it. They are the ones that have the biggest stake in this. Ukraine has sold off much of its assets over the years just to remain, within the West's, eyesight, within its radar.
No, and crazy. Before James, one quick point I wanted to make is absolutely the internet was on fire over the weekend. Like, it was out of control. We had Pikachus, we had Batmans, we had Spider-Mans, the Joker. I shared some of these on the X. I mean, some of them were artificially altered, but they were amazing, iconic. But the other thing, obviously, James, I mean, the interest rates, right? Erdogan has gone through how many different members of his own family or brothers in putting them in as the central banker to try and get the lira under control. Interesting choice of policy, I have to admit. But anyway.
Well, I mean, it's very much tied up with his, his religious viewpoints. I mean, interest rates are not something considered un-Islamic. And so Erdogan has been trying to square that circle for a long time. And so has seen this, and we've heard all the conspiracy theorizing, but there has been a sense that things have become incredibly tough now working in Turkey. I remember I was at a really interesting conference a couple of years ago, and there was an economist who was speaking and said, "Listen, what you've got to understand is that Turkish CEOs are highly in incredible demand in many Western countries because." These are people who have been able to build very successful companies in very, very unstable economic circumstances. And if you think about it, that's absolutely right. I mean, I remember the old Turkish lira, and then they brought in the new Turkish lira because the old Turkish lira had just gone way up. I mean, you were talking sort of millions for every sort of euro or whatever. And so they said, right, we'll redenominate it and introduce it as the new Turkish lira. And it's creeping up again. It's just not holding that stability, and this is a perennial problem that Turkey faces. But what's been really interesting, in some ways, it's a little reminiscent of Italy for many decades. That what it meant is that you had these business leaders who were forged in the fire of very, very uncertain economics, and were incredibly good. But what this economist was saying, which I found fascinating, is saying it had got to a level now that business community said, listen, we can't manage it anymore. This is getting too much for us now, which I think was a really, really interesting sign. But I mean, the thing was, the takeaway from this conference, which was almost 2 years ago, was to say that Turkey's economy was imminently going to collapse. And here we are. I mean, it's a bad economic situation, but it hasn't imploded in quite the same way. And so this is a country which still continues onwards.
It's like Russia in that regard, no? Because they're both have proven to be somewhat resilient in that regard. Like the policies haven't been as death-defying as we were told. People are saying the West is overdoing it, and both the Turkish and Russian economies. I find myself comparing these two. Obviously, their circumstances, context are very different. But
it's interesting to make those sort of comparisons. Exactly.
Yeah.
I think Turkey, as I say, the underlying factors are obviously very, very different in all sorts of ways. But you're right. There is this sort of sense: are these going to implode? And we've seen a lot of comments about what's going to happen with Russia. And I'm not going to start off.
Okay. Before, I want to ask you guys another question, but people were asking me what I was talking about, so I was sharing the screen. This is what I'm talking about. I don't think all these guys are here. I definitely
this one.
I'm standing on the
yeah, this one's a little doctored, but the video of Pikachu being chased by the gendarme, that's absolutely
we
true.
have this somewhere. Yeah, this is my and on this note, everybody here we go, everybody. So there's Pikachu running around.
That's the one.
Yeah, quality stuff. Unfortunately, he was running away from people who were tear gassing him. But and obviously, guys, I mean, this is my Twitter, but do follow the two gentlemen if you don't. It's good to step outside of your comfort zone and support each other's work. We are varied. If we do even call ourselves two liberals and a Marxist, we have varying viewpoints on things. So it's nice to have, I think, conversations outside of echo chambers. So we encourage you to support us and our communities. But anyway, I guess the question I had for both of you was sort of like, so where do we go from here then, right? This was obviously in the build up for Imamoglu's sort of presidential campaign for, is it 2028? That's still quite a way off though. So sort of to be undertaking such actions, 3 years ahead of the election itself, it seems a little bit premature, doesn't it? Or I don't really want to.
I think it was very much so the JHP were about to Republican People's Party. I have to sort of check myself because there's a JHP here in Cyprus. So it's like, I am talking, not Republican Turkish Party. Republican People's Party is the Turkish one. JHP they were just on the verge of selecting Imamoglu as their presidential candidate. That's why Erdogan had to step in when he did, because even though the election is 3 years out, once you've got that candidate in place, and then you can put all the energy into sort of building them up, this then forces the party onto the back foot, of course, because they can't, even if it's to sort of select another candidate, you don't want the unseemly sight of just saying, right, okay, he's been banged up, so this is our next candidate. They've got to sort of say, right, okay, how are we going to get him out? What are we going to do? So it was deliberately designed to put the main opposition and the leading contender on the back foot, or just completely push them out of the political scene altogether, which so that rather explains why it seems a bit odd that 2028 is the date. But of course, the other thing that I think it's really important to mention in all of this is that there's a lot of speculation that Erdogan wants to change the constitution again. So he's at the moment barred from running for a third term. As effectively, Turkey changed to a presidential system, and then it was confirmed and he was elected. So this, you could already argue, is his third term. is a third term, but he would say, no, the clock was restarted,
Yes.
and then he was elected once, he's elected twice. He's now got to step down in 2028. But there's talk that he wants to try and change the constitution. The trouble is he doesn't have the votes at the moment. But lo and behold, he's now entered into a peace process with the Kurds, which many feel is maybe his attempt to try and change the electoral maths in his favor, although it does seem quite difficult if you look at the parliamentary structure as to how he would still get those votes.
I do want to get people involved as well in the comments. So if you have a comment, then, well, you know, a question, but like this one is a good point, right? It's not only about also removing his own limited constitutional limitations, but also preventing Imamoglu, because they said that he didn't have a degree and then therefore he can't run to be a president.
That's it. Stripping him was a very clear act.
So it's both ways. It's removing the limitations on himself whilst imposing more on his primal candidates, so that he can't. So there's literally no alternative to Erdogan, because from what I remember in the presidential last couple of years ago, which we covered extensively on the channel, there was a lot of emphasis about I forget the name of the candidate who ran against him. But it was not so much that Erdogan was doing a great job of actually leading the country, because they also had the earthquake, remember, which hit Turkey and Syria appallingly hard. But it was because the opposition parties were in such disarray. It was basically like he was the least bad option because he came off as the most competent still, because the opposition couldn't settle on their candidate early enough. And that's, to your point, James, I think why they're really trying to get behind this singular guy early on, and therefore they're coming out with these new tactics to try to strip him of any legitimacy. But anyway,
it was very clearly that this was the thinking behind it, that they wanted to, and as I say, stripping him of the degree, but the fact that he was arrested the next day. But of course, Erdogan has said, listen, the arrest nothing to do with me. This is, you're impugning the Turkish judicial system by saying that I had a hand in it. But the convenient timing, literally 3 or 4 days before this big party congress, which was going to choose. I mean, if I remember rightly, he was running unopposed as well, so it was a shoo-in. It was a coronation, really.
This is a typical tactic in hybrid regimes, which is demobilize your opposition and look for ways to make it difficult for them to gain a footing. So, if you can, Peter, you can go back to that comment just beforehand, because it was the name of the other
Kemal
Kılıçdaroğlu. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. He was the one that ran against Erdogan about 2 years ago, and it was up until election day it was a nail biter. But there were a couple of things that he had said that had sort of weakened the party's position, and Erdogan was able to come out. I should also point out that the comment that was beforehand about you have to have a law degree to be president, if the username is who I think it is, yes, one of my former students and now a good friend of mine. So if it is Stephen Aracic, good for you. Good to know that you're listening in on all of us here. Yes, I think I know that. Yes, Stephen's.
That's awesome.
He's a good friend.
Hello, Michael's former student. Good evening.
How old is this student? Or how young are you, Michael? Why have you got?
No, it is him. It's confirmed. Yeah.
Yes, it is. Yes, no, it's way back in. We're going way back in the day. He's was easily one of my top five. One of my top five in the 20+ years that I've been teaching. So
as long as it's not sort of like American school kids and you're sleeping with these students, Michael. Sorry, I had to go there, but
all right. Well, that just took a weird turn.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. No. Anyways,
okay.
Where I was, where was I? Oh yeah, it's, think about hybrid regime tactics, and so the understanding of keeping CHP off foot, either trying to figure out how we get him out of jail, or do we now pivot towards Kılıçdaroğlu, who is not as popular as İmamoğlu, is one thing. But to do this now, knowing that the elections are not for another 3 years, turns İmamoğlu into a lightning rod. It makes him into a symbol, right? He's in jail. He is now he's become Mandela-fied. He's become someone who is now potentially going to be a symbol of resistance. against Erdogan's government. So I still am wondering, was this just a gutsy move because he can do whatever he wants? Or is this just a unbelievably stupid, desperate move because Erdogan is becoming more and more paranoid? I am, at this point, I am deferring more to the latter than the former. That's just, how I see it there. And there was something else I was going to, the Constitution. This is something that Russia has successfully done. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have done the same thing as well. And that is change the Constitution around to whatever the meaning is, whatever the text is. But as James says, by changing the Constitution around to allow the person who is in power now to stay in power, it resets that clock. So Putin did this. What was it in 2012?
Well, 2008 to 2012, he
dropped. Well, that was the first time around. Then he steps down. Medvedev basically came in to, as we all know, just hold the parking spot. Putin is back in 2012, which no one was going to doubt that he was going to get. But then at some point he rewrote the Constitution was rewritten to now effectively say that a president can only serve 2 consecutive 6-year, 7-year terms, and that's it. Like 2 terms and you're out. But of course, this resets everything for Putin, allowing him to effectively stay in power until 2030. The current president of Uzbekistan, if everything goes according to plan, will be president until 2037. And the current president of Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, this one's interesting. It's a 7-year one-time deal. Mm-hmm. So 7 years, but he was able to get reelected, so he will be in power at least until what year is it now? 2025, at another probably 2031, 2032, which is enough to seal the legacy and to solidify the party. Which, if Erdogan is doing this now, it gives me reason to believe that AK is not as secure in its position as its supporters would like to think that it is.
Well, I was going to say one thing to your broader comment before, which is that I think, it becomes almost a sense of inevitability, really. The more that the individual who runs the country becomes paranoid, or the more they sense that the wars are creeping in on them, the more paranoid they get and the more they try to centralize that control. But to such a point there by which, well, there'll be backlash, right? There's only so far Putin can go in trying to centralize the power even more, right? He's really began to accelerate shit up since the end of last year, I think, middle of last year, and well, you could argue before, maybe with the Wagner mutiny, but it's the same with Erdogan, right? The more that people try to challenge him, the more he has to take another step to encroach on the individual liberties and political freedoms of literally evicting a journalist from the country. That's a new one for me, for someone who's been there for years, right? And it's pretty stark. There's not really any other way you can frame that as other than just suppressing media freedom of expression and coverage. So I think there comes a point where he can't do too much more unless he just becomes full-blown dictator, which he tries to portray himself as. No, he's just the elected guy who's a bit heavy-handed with people who are dissidents and trying to undermine his leadership, sort of thing. That basically the plausible deniability and the smoke and mirror effects can't last indefinitely, I think.
But there's a bigger opposition movement in Turkey. There's a far more organized, established movement. Intellectual opposition, political, cultural opposition, the whole, secular versus Islamic, the nostalgia for old city Istanbul, Constantinople, that kind of stuff is still alive and well. It's still alive and well there. So he does not. So journalists and independent universities, we need to remember, are very much centers that would resist this type of authoritative political culture. Something that you don't have in Russia. In Russia, Putin has been able to absolutely corner the market on patriotism and national conservatism. Very different from that in Turkey.
I think it's the sort of, presence of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans and just that historical geographical influence that allowed Western values to seep into the Ottoman Empire as more. Russia never had such influence and integration, I think, in that way. And therefore, Turkey has always held, there's always been an aspect of the society that has had that little bit more, not that Europeanism is the be all end all. Point being is, though, that there's been this greater influx of democratic ideas and principles. And plus, it's also just bordering Greece. I mean, that kind of helps. I mean, from my perspective, at least. But Russia just doesn't have that same extended in integration, I think. But I don't know.
I mean, yeah, I just actually, and Michael, maybe you've got a take on this, and Piotr, both of you. I mean, no, I definitely get a sense. I mean, we saw a major clear out in Turkey after 2016, and there were huge purges in the civil service, in universities, in the military, in the judiciary, across the board. Erdogan, anyone suspected of being having sort of anti-Erdogan views, and this whole Gulen movement was purged. But I've always had a sense that there's been a much more active anti-Erdogan movement within the Turkish diaspora. I mean, a lot are loyal to Erdogan, but there's a lot who speak out, and a lot of intellectuals who speak out. And I've always had a sense that's far stronger amongst Turks abroad than it is amongst Russians abroad.
Yeah.
Yes.
But for some reason, Russians abroad, maybe there's a whole world that we're not exposed to, but I don't get that sense that, you know, people speak out in nearly the same way that I know many Turks who are very, very unhappy with Erdogan, and will say, listen, I have the luxury of being able to do that abroad, and I will use that you know, to affect and speak, you know, say things. I mean, you know, sometimes might be more measured, but you definitely get a sense there's far more debate going on amongst Turks outside of Turkey.
Mm-hmm. Did we lose Peter?
I think maybe we've lost him for a second, but I mean, Michael, I mean, you know, as somebody who follows sort of Russia very closely, I mean, is that very much the sort of sense of how you see things?
Yeah, I mean, there is just a longer established secular Turkish political culture that you will find as opposed to Russia. And that's not to say that there aren't, you know, Russian political alternatives. They're very atomistic. And I think that they're much more popular in the West than they have any kind of real traction in Russia, for that matter. And I'm wondering if are we all here? Yes?
Yeah.
No? Oh, okay. Yeah, I just wanted to know if the screen froze. So that at least gives us something to, and Erdogan knows this as well, right? That gives him the understanding that there is much more of an organized opposition. You don't see this in Russia. The big issue, which is not talked about in Russia right now, is what is going to happen after 2030, because Putin's second term is up. And as far as the new constitutional, you know, the new constitutional arrangement, that's it. He's done, right? That's it. Unless he changes the constitution again. I don't think that's going to happen. But it's the one question that you as a journalist want to ask, but you don't. And if you're interviewing people within Russia's political elite, you want to ask this question, but you don't, and the political elite don't want to give any hints, and that is, who comes after Putin? This is like a fiercely guarded issue, and everybody's got their ideas of who it could be, who it could, you know, possibly here, there, or the other. Right now, and don't take this anything beyond just an open-ended hypothesis, but the current Minister of Defense, Andrei Belosov, who was put in to replace Shoigu, who was moved to the State Security Council to replace Patrushev, who is now working behind the scenes with Putin, very, very close. But you know, it's a shuffle. It's an internal court shuffle here. But keep your eye on Belosov because he is a bit more charismatic and someone who is put into this position. Is done so, you know, as a trial run. I could be completely wrong. But I cannot see anyone within the to take over, right? And one thing that we will be absolutely certain about: Putin's successor will not come directly from the electorate. That's just not going to happen.
So that's the interesting thing, isn't it? You don't, you know, you can think in Turkey.
I think that.
Yeah.
Okay, James, why don't you?
No, I
that's
wasn't sure. Piotr was about to say something. No, I was just saying that I think this is the interesting thing, that in Turkey, you can have very serious discussions about potential successors to Erdogan, and there are very clear names out there, whereas you just don't really have that much of a sense, certainly, again, from an outside perspective, on that in Russia. I mean, there's all sorts of names that have been, I mean, the one that I was about to say if it comes from AKP, but it doesn't come from AKP because, of course, it's Hakan Fidan, who is now the foreign minister, who many sort of say this could be a very likely successor. But I'm not sure, again, maybe, in the audience can correct me, but I don't believe he's actually an AKP member as such. He's somebody... I found him very interesting for a long time because he is really trusted by Erdogan. And for anyone who doesn't know, he used to be head of the Turkish intelligence service, and then he moved over to become, when Mevlut Çavuşoğlu was sort of maneuvered into a different position, who'd been a very loyal spokesman for Erdogan. But what I found really interesting is that the way that Turkish foreign policy decision-making works, that what had happened is that Turkey had moved to a more American-style model of how they engage in foreign policy. So it used to be that the Turkish foreign minister was a very influential figure in setting foreign policy and communicating foreign policy. And then you move to a much more American system. So for anyone who, it's a bit of a crude generalization, and this is why it's been sort of quite interesting talking about, Waltz in America this past week, is that in America, foreign policy, a lot of the foreign policy thinking goes in via the NSA, or the National Security Council, National Security Advisor. President decides, and then it gets fed out via State Department. It's a bit crude. It's a bit more complex than that, but it works in a slightly different way than I think many of us are used to. So, for example, in the UK, the Foreign Office is very much about setting foreign policy. The Prime Minister will make a final decision, but it's much more all encapsulated. Turkey moved more to that other system, and Çavuşoğlu was somebody who really represented Turkish foreign policy, but you didn't really get a sense that he would make a lot of it. Whereas Fidan, and another chap called Ibrahim Kalin, who now has taken over from Fidan as head of the intelligence service, were those people who were very close to Erdogan, that were really working with Erdogan to shape foreign policy. So the fact that Erdogan's put Fidan in such a public position has really returned a lot of power to the foreign ministry that I think had been missing under Çavuşoğlu. So it's a very, very interesting, it's made Fidan much more front and center. People who followed Turkey knew who he was. Head of MIT or MIT was a very senior figure, but not one that tended to be terribly well known outside of Turkey. And so putting him in that role and knowing that this is somebody that Erdogan trusts, I think has been a really, really interesting development, and says a lot. So I think there's a lot who are looking at him as a potential. And then obviously you've got within the political parties and things like that. So it's a much more open discussion, I think, in Turkey.
It's actually a conversation to be had in Turkey, unlike Russia. I mean, coming from the country and having I find myself naturally drawn to the Russian communities anyway here in Petrograd or Londongrad, in that you just sort of end up talking to people, they recognize your name, you end up meeting Russians. And there is, just to go back to the original question you had before, James, about sort of the willingness of the should we say diaspora to speak out. There isn't really one. There are Russians that do, but most of the time the Russians that do are either Western educated or have some partial Western influence. A girl that I'm currently seeing is, she's born in Russia, but she grew up in Canada. She went to protests, but she is Russian by full-blown black background. And I find it incredibly unlikely that you're going to see Russians, there are Russians that decided to flee. Obviously, the 1-2 million that fled to Georgia in the end of 2022 after the partial mobilization was drafted. But the likelihood that it's going to be against sort of, shall we say, intellectuals of Turkish origin, nowhere near the same comparison. And I think that there is that influence of Europe again. I mean, greater integration in certain areas in terms of trade, maybe between Turkey and Europe than there is in Russia.
But also, is there not is there not a fear?
Well, of course there is. Of course there is the undisputed fear. I mean, but I also think that it's difficult because even I think the nuance in Russia is perhaps a little bit less understood in the sense of my father, for example, right? He's got a PhD, very educated. He spent 20 years in England, but he doesn't like Zelensky, and he has a lot of criticism for the West. So he's quite conventional in that interpretation, but he is abhorrently opposed to Putin and wants the country to have alternative forms of leadership. So there are Russians that I think are a mix in that they're not like all out about Western supportive, but neither are they supportive of Putin. It's sort of a blend. Yeah. They're not, and they're anti-war, but they're not pro-Putin or whatever, right? They're not anti. Yeah. So it's, and I think maybe it's not as nuanced in Turkey. I'm not sure. I'm not as much of an expert, but I definitely think because Putin has done such an effective job, and this brings me to the other point you were talking about in terms of successes, Michael. I can't talk to successes of Turkey, but someone I always felt was sort of someone suitable was Nikolai Patrushev, but he's effectively the same age. And I do think that Borisov is a good shout, actually, because, and this is the broader point, which is sort of the Turkish element, which is that I think that because Putin has done such a good job, they're not looking to replace him with someone who has similar ideas to Putin. They're literally just someone looking for a technocrat kind of guy who will carry out Putin's ideological approach. Right, he's just a handler of Putinism, unlike in Turkey, where they want someone who will adopt Erdogan, but maybe blend it in their own slight way. Right, that slight degree of greater openness has meant that you get leaders who allow a slight interpretation, versus in Russia it's just Putin, but it's carried out by a different bunch of people. Right?
But that's interesting, Piotr, because that would, and sorry to jump in, but that actually is really interesting, because to my mind, and again, look, I mean, this is, so I worked on Turkey for 30 years. I mean, this is a country that I've been to many times. I've been fascinated in it. It's a very, very interesting country in all sorts of ways, and I've worked on its political history and things. I would say, to my mind, that it's far easier to identify an ideological base to Erdogan than it is to Putin. So you say somebody who would adhere to Putinism. I don't quite know what that means. But I feel much more comfortable being able to say what an ideological successor to Erdogan would look like. Maybe
all I'm trying to say is that Putin has centralized power so much that it's more about continuing his legacy interpretation, largely speaking, than it is someone else who's aligned to Erdogan but might make slight adjustments here and there. It's not as, you know what I mean?
Let me jump in on this, because with Turkey, it's clearly defined by the political party. In Russia, it's defined by the security state, which happens to have a political party. It is not as either or like you have in Turkey. In Russia, and this is how I've come to regard this, and this really solidified this. What was it, about a year ago with the whole Prigozhin incident? Is that Russia is effectively run like a mafia and an empire. And I'm not being snarky. I'm not being overtly critical or pro-West. I'm just simply calling it what it is, in that a mafia is run by a group of people behind the scenes who make all the decisions. It's a council, and that is the Siloviki, as far as Russia is concerned, of which Putin is one would say, the chairman of the board. Alongside that, you have Patrushev, you have Narishkin, Shoigu, Lavrov, Ivanov, Shechin, among others. These are the people that run the country behind the scenes. These are the ones that are wedded to, if you want to say, like, what is Putinism? I would say it's not so much Putinism, but this term sovereign democracy, which who came up with that term? Vladislav Surkov, sometime in the early 2000s. Putin doesn't use the term all that much. Lavrov doesn't use the term that much, but it's effectively the idea that in order for Russia to be strong, it needs to have full sovereign control over its destiny, economic control, political, military, what have you. Hence the reason why sanctions are seen in Russia as the sanctions are seen as a great opportunity for economic self-sufficiency, right? playing also on what I call the sort of the national conservative strategy of adhering to the 4 Fs: faith, family, flag, and fatherland. And this has been the ideology that Russia has used. It is a form of soft power that I think has been adopted in ways like in Orban's Hungary, Fico Slovakia, Vucic's Serbia, although we can, I want to get to Vucic. I want to get to the protests in Serbia as well. Erdogan is certainly looking at this. Interestingly enough, this idea of sovereign democracy came before Putin in the leadership of 2 incredibly long-lasting presidents of Central Asia, Nursultan Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan and Islam Karimov in Uzbekistan, both of whom basically became the founding fathers of countries that need to form identities, national histories, among others. So the successor to Putin is going to be somebody who is going to continue with that prescripted security state playbook, whoever it happens to be. If it's Belosov, so be it. I don't think Patrushev or Narishkin are going to be part of it for the simple reason that they work behind the scenes. They're not charismatic. They're incredibly boring to listen to. Even Shoigu will read from script. We want people with some form of charisma. And the big problem with Putin right now is he's sort of becoming the Tito to Russia, in that who comes after Tito? Somebody unbelievably nowhere near as awesome.
But Michael, that's the point I'm trying to make, maybe poorly done, but like Kim Jong-un of North Korea, right? He simply had his sons to carry out his legacy, right? There wasn't much difference. The point I'm making, Putin has done such an effective job of removing any and alternative forms that he just wants someone to carry it out. I'm not saying there's a son, obviously, I don't know about, but that's my point. It's right. It's not the same in Turkey, because Erdogan has allowed, or is allowing, some degree of, he's putting all yes men in. So there'll be people they might have varied alternatives, but it's not literally just someone he wants to carry it out in a complete ideological sort of way, right? Like that. That's all I'm trying to say. So no, I mean, I don't think Shoigu would be. He's an idiot. Patrushev is too old. I did feel like that, but yeah, I mean, there are still plenty of people. But then again, Putin doesn't look too bad for his health at 72. Everyone's been fantasizing around Trump because he was walking to the helicopter 2 days ago, and he looks like he's lost weight at 78. I mean, these guys are going to live for a while.
Having said that, Zelensky has just, again, I think within the last 24 hours, said that he thinks Putin is very ill and on his way out.
Wow, that's Ukraine.
I don't buy that in. I don't buy that. He's been saying that Putin's been dying for the last 10, 15 years.
I don't believe that. I think that's Ukrainian information warfare, much like the Russians have their own, right? Both sides are doing it. What I would say is I did make a video today about the car bomb, because that is quite interesting. And I think it's overhyped. There's not much that's going to come from it, but it was still quite interesting to see Zelensky's comments, and then that happened. So anyway, but yeah, I mean, we could continue talking about this. I don't know if there was anything else you guys wanted to touch on.
Well, I guess because we were talking, James had mentioned that, there's protests happening all over now. You have protests in Turkey. You have them in Serbia. This is a big one, which, interestingly enough, the Serbian government is claiming that this is a color revolution, which is an outright lie. There's been no external involvement, to my knowledge, whatsoever. The EU has even come out to condemn the protests. Russia has condemned the protests. The EU is condemned. America is condemned. Everybody's condemning the protests in Serbia. The students who are leading the charge are doing a phenomenal job doing 2 things: A, keeping outside influence out, and B, not allowing the laughable political opposition to even remotely capitalize on this. The sad reality is that Vucic is going to ride this out, because unless this is translated into votes, he is going to win the next round of elections, which is the reason why 2 things are happening. A, Vucic is largely ignoring this. And B, the students are, it's not just the student. I mean, it's a growing collectivity in Serbia who are just, they've had enough of Vucic. They've had enough of the Serbian Progressive Party. You know, are you serious? Do you think there's a revolution without outside influence in
I
Europe?
just wanted to spice it up a little bit.
It's not so much it's just a general sense of, you know what, we've had enough. I mean, we have just had enough of just the level of corruption. But no, I mean, unless
James is holding his tongue.
I mean, I don't know.
I'm just thinking. I think Michael's making excellent points. I think my look of skepticism is just simply that you've got mass protests against Vučić. Michael's absolutely right. They've kept the opposition at arm's length. And they've kept outside elements to arm's length, which in some ways I think is really unfortunate and probably actually not doing them a lot of good, in the sense that they're not sending out the message that we want to get rid of Vučić because we want to get EU accession back on the track, which I think might offer more of a message that outsiders could get onto. And there are a worrying number, for example, of Russian flags and Kosovo, yes, Serbia, sort of in the demonstrations, enough to make a lot of Europeans very nervous about what this could mean, you know, and there is all the theory that, you know, Europe actually finds it much easier to deal with Vučić. And I think that's very right in all sorts of ways. But I think it's this sort of strange thing that these protests are oddly depoliticized. And as Michael said, they're not translating into trying to win votes. What they're saying is that we are so fed up with the political system that we just don't want to engage at all with any politicians. We want to sweep away everything, and we want an entirely new political system.
Well, if I can ask you a couple of questions on this, then, because I've been focused on Turkey, I've been focused on Ukraine, and so much of Trump and the signal chatter from last week, which was just hilarious, but also terrifying. Which was that sort of, I've always found Serbia fascinating under Vučić, because Vučić is sort of, I mean, the word that comes to mind for both him and to bring it back to our main focus this afternoon, Turkey, is hedging. Both try to hedge, I think, quite well in terms of Western and non-Western interests. Vučić, I mean, that's sort of my first question is for you guys is, do you agree with such a sentiment? Not really. Vučić is quite, I don't really know what to make of him sometimes. He sounds like he's sort of quite keen to deepen relations with the West, or at least improve them. And then at other times he's like, you know, saying all sorts of things that the Russians will fully get on board with. I never really know what to make of Serbia under Vučić. And also, just to add one last point before I trigger everyone on the Kosovo-Serbia aspect, but obviously Pristina's actions in the past several months have been objectively annoying NATO. They have been pissing off Western support, provocative statements, whatever, right? I'm not taking sides in this. I'm just trying to summarize the highly contentious and sensitive situation. But Vučić has sort of not gotten too involved in that and seems to have come out all right. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on these sorts of themes, but I find it pretty...
Florian Bieber, I don't know if he coined the term, but I know that he uses the term. He calls people like Vučić a stabilitocrat. And it's, you know, again, we make words up just to, you know, I've
always felt it's far more uncomfortable than it's not my favorite term. I mean, I understand where they're coming from, but it's unwieldy.
But it's a way that it's like hedging. It's a way of selling yourself to the West, selling yourself to the diplomatic circle outside, that you're the one that is holding all of this stuff together, that you're going to be the one making all of the major decisions, and the other, you know, because the alternative is, if it's not me, then it's some crazy nationalist. You know, if it's not Fidesz, it's Jobbik. If it's not AKP, it's NHP. If it's not these guys, it's the crazies. It's something like that, right? And the EU, for better or for worse, has been taking the bait, right? They've been taking the bait. They see Vučić as either the best that Serbia has to offer, or they quietly acknowledge that there is no opposition. I mean, the opposition has been just completely atomized within Serbia. And it's less to do with Vučić suppressing the opposition than it is ordinary Serbs looking at the opposition and saying, you guys have had your fun in the sun. You screwed up. You're ridiculously corrupt. We just do not want any of Borko Stefanovic, any of these guys. We don't, Boris Tadic, we don't want you. Which, as far as Vučić is concerned, is saying, this is my ace. This is great. Fantastic. They're pissed off. But what are they going to do when it comes to the election? They're going to sit home, or they're going to write in, all sorts of, flowery, poetic Serbian words that, whatever, and that basically is, I mean, look, I'm reading for my comparative class on Marxism, capitalism, and nationalism. This week we're doing Antonio Gramsci, and good early 20th century Italian communist Marxist who talks about the sort of the omnipotence of the state, in which the state is eventually self-reinforcing in terms of its hegemony. So if you're working within an electoral democratic system, a structural electoral democratic system, which what Serbia is, and there is clear revulsion against the current government, that is step one. Okay, the current government is in trouble. But if the protests openly say we're just simply angry, and we don't have any we don't have any organized opposition, and this kind of thing, it's like Leninism kind of allows Marxism to work, because you need organization, you need leadership, and they're not doing it. So as far as Vučić is concerned, let them protest. It's good for publicity because it shows me that I'm allowing freedom of speech to happen, although every so often there's always going to be some scuttle and some idiot car drivers going to run into the crowd, or we hear things about sound wave cannons or whatever it is, right? But other than that, I mean, he is going to just simply ignore, continue to meet with heads of state, with EU officials, and he's good. He's in good with the Trump administration, which is very slowly, I think the goal here is to get them to be more sympathetic to Serbia's case in Kosovo. Does not help the Albanian side one bit that Albin Kurti is an impudent. No, he's an ideologue. Whatever. This is where James and I are going to compete over, who can come up with the worst words for Kurti. But no, I mean, he's absolutely just, he's an awful little human being. But this is working in Vučić's favor. And so I guess the point with all of this is that you can have mass protests across the country every single day, but unless this translates into organized electoral opposition.
And Michael, I think you actually also touch on another problem, which I somebody who's sort of worked on the Balkans for many years as well, it's always been a really big problem that I've found in the Balkans, and we're seeing it in Serbia, is there's no concept of evidence-driven policy making. The opposition just exists to say we hate the government, early elections. Yeah, there's absolutely no sense of putting together manifestos. There's no sense of gathering data to show health outcomes, for example, education outcomes, to then hold that up and say, this is the record of the government. This is atrocious. Yeah. This is what we will do if we come to power. This is where we're going to raise money. This is where we're going to be spending money. These are the figures that we're going to bring down in terms of mortality rates. These are the levels that we're going to bring up in terms of literacy. This is absolutely missing in Balkan politics. It's shockingly so, for where we are. So far behind, and opposition has never caught on to this. They've never really understood this. And all opposition seems to be in Serbia and much of the Balkans is just shouting, this government is corrupt, it's awful, early elections. And people say, what are you going to do? You're just as bad as them. And I think it sort of, it becomes this, and I will annoy people now, it becomes this self-reinforcing vicious circle of nihilism that you get in a lot of the Balkans. I think you'll find more people agreeing with you than it is. It's just, and this is what the students are doing. Yes, all politicians are as bad as each other. We don't want any of them, but not coming up with anything. And this is just constantly missing. And that also makes it difficult for the outside, for the European Union to look at these countries and say look at the opposition and say, right, okay, we know what they want to do. Mm-hmm. That they've got a clear plan of action that, which says we want to start opening EU accession talks on this chapter, that chapter, that chapter. These are going to be our focus. In the judiciary, this is what we want to do about the speed of processing court cases. This is what we want to do to get, deal with our prison situation. All of these things. And it takes hard work. And they never show up to do it. And
I tell
so-
you what, guys, we need to have a proper session, maybe next week, next time.
Oh
on
yeah, no,
Serbia
this
and
is this
Kosovo.
absolutely. We
I think
return
it's
to
about
this.
time we did that. Maybe, I mean, Michael, you'll be moving back from where you are at the moment. And
No, I'm here for 2 more months. I'm here for 2 more. So
stop
there's no
ruining the surprise. I was trying to say we'll all do a meetup in Cyprus, and well, not that James knows that yet, but
We will. All
no,
right.
we'll
yeah.
just I don't know. We'll do sort of like a live session from Cyprus on the Balkans or something. I don't know. Anyway, I have
Live session from Cyprus on Cyprus. Ah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There's a radical idea.
Go down cahoots, right, in the middle of Nicosia or Nicosia, about northern Cyprus and northern Cypriot territory. Anyway, I do think we should have a deeper dive into Serbia and Kosovo. I've been in touch.
Yeah. Oh, there's a whole bunch there, but no, absolutely. But anyway, I mean, it's been a great conversation, mainly about Turkey. Lots to discuss there, and I think we covered a lot of ground.
I find
Fascinating
I do this
country.
often, which is Turkey becomes a focus for. It's not something that you talk about recurring, but when you do a proper focus on Turkey because there's so many different elements that it brings in.
Oh
and
yeah,
then
it's a
you
fascinating country.
But yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It was really interesting. And yeah, I'm glad that we can do this on a regular basis. I don't know if you guys have anything you've got coming up you want to shout out. But otherwise, maybe we can draw it to a close for this afternoon.
That's perfectly fine with me.
All right. Well, James, anything from you?
No, just looking at some of the abuse.
There are some
Apparently,
great-
I
to
don't
be
know what
fair-
I'm talking about when it comes to Balkan politics. That
Yeah,
politics is
you pissed
more
everyone
grounded
off
than I
now.
am.
But up
You live in
until
La
this
La
point,
Land.
everyone most people were very pleasant, and Lee Patterson wants us to do a discussion on the US and Israel moving to strike Iran. I'm not sure they are going to directly strike Iran. I know what the X is saying. And speaking of X, some of you were commenting, where can we follow? So this is James's handle, James Kerlindsey, at James Kerlindsey on X. This is Michael's Rossi Sai.
I'm on Blue Sky now, by the way.
And James is on Blue Sky.
My
Yes.
Twitter.
And this is mine, in case you want to follow me. Mine's just P Curzin. But also do obviously subscribe and support us on YouTube and Blue Sky and everywhere. And James has started doing podcasts, which is exciting. I'm doing more.
Starting to do more interviews and things. So yeah.
interviews.
If anyone's interested in why China's siege strategy of Taiwan might not work, I'm going to give a plug to this week's Friday's video. So that's the latest thing that I've tackled.
I have a video coming out on why the world's newest country might be on the brink of civil war. So
which one? Oh gosh, right, I have to go and watch that
Sudan.
one.
You have to watch the video to find out, James. That's the point of these deliberately ambiguous titles. It makes you go,
most recent translation I did was yesterday, 2 days ago, where Putin had come up with the idea of putting Ukraine under temporary UN administration. So primary source material.
Crazy as it sounds. Well,
yes.
and yes. He stopped actually shooting breaking the ceasefire that he so wishes. Anyway, everybody, thank you very much. Thank you very much from to Turkey, from everyone around the world. James Kerlindsey, Michael Rossi, two liberals and a Marxist. We are out, and we'll see you all next time.